Good afternoon and welcome to Lunchtime Series with me, Kim Britz, proudly powered by Leadership by Design.co, leading the charge with insights, information, ultimately effective results. Joining me in today's leadership and coaching segment, we have a transformational leadership expert, leadership speaker, executive coach, facilitator, and advisor. Also a neurodiversity ADHD high performance coach, education and corporate advisory, and an author of upcoming book, Infinite Leadership, all the way from down under. Kylee Leota, how are you doing, Kylee?
Thank you for such a lovely introduction, Kevin. I'm great. As I said, it's been an interesting day, but I'm so grateful to be finishing my day by spending time in the presence of greatness.
Fantastic. I love that. Thank you. And so, I mean, to kick it off, before we start, I mean, I've given a bit of synopsis of who you are and what you do, but don't you want to give listeners just something about you and just some insight about what it is you do?
Yeah, so I often joke I was a bit of an accidental business leader because I was in education for over 20 years. And in 2019, I actually injured myself. And as a result of that, I think, sometimes the universe is pretty good at I've tried those subtle cues, you're not listening. So now I'm going to sit you on your butt and you have to pay attention. So I think probably what the universe was trying to tell me was that I hadn't been listening for a while. Education, as we know, is ever evolving and ever changing. I'm sure in South Africa, it's no different in that sense. And it just was no longer aligning to my true north in terms of my areas of what I was, I guess, really passionate about in terms of building capacity holistically. So that injury kind of made me reflect, and I looked at all the bits of the job that I loved and took out every bit of the job that I didn't like timetabling and all of that kind of stuff, and looked at, that Simon Sinek's version of, know your why. And I thought it was always to be a principle, but really it was about empowerment of others. So I crafted that into my own business. And so I've been running my own business, particularly in the idea of self-leadership and in that leadership space for the last couple of years. And I just love what I do. So, we talk about things that give you energy and things that drain your energy. And every so often I sit, reflect how grateful I am that even though I do big days sometimes, I actually come away really energized from my days. I get to spend time with people I love, doing what I love, empowering people, which is doing what I love. I get to walk in my alignment and with purpose every single day.
And I love that because, when you, I'm making a generalization on this, but the umpteen times that I've looked at and worked with executives around purpose and saying, what is your purpose? And do you know what it is? Do you know how to define it? And do you know what the process is to kind of make it, bring it to the forefront? And I think it's a huge conversation that most individuals kind of steer away from. So, on that point, why, just from your perspective, your insights and your education background, why do we need to know about purpose?
Yeah, I think it's really hard for people because it's quite abstract. I think, executives get stuck in the data that they can capture, and it's quite linear. And we like to see what we're working on, right? So when we're talking about purpose and things like that, we're talking about an abstract concept that takes us into a bit of a deeper dive. And I think so many people have gone into this idea of self-protection, and the version of myself that I show up at work is not necessarily the version of myself. And I think the more that we can walk in alignment with our purpose, we can be our true authentic selves both in and out of work, because it's more aligned to where we're going. I also think having a vision, I actually came across this memory today, and it was like, who are you uninterrupted? So if you were able to be uninterrupted by all the craziness of what goes on in the world, what would you love to be doing? And that's a really good step in the right direction of, the bit that gives fulfilling and purpose driven. And I think we are much more engaged if we're getting to work in alignment with our purpose and towards our purpose, and generally something greater than ourselves. So I think that just gives us more fulfillment. It certainly gives me more energy, and everyone that I work with, when they're clear on what that looks like, it makes everything else sort of, that clarity piece just serves as such a huge purpose for being able to then figure out what strategies work and how to get there and what we need to do moving forward. So it kind of fills in that backward mapping idea of what next, and where to from here.
Absolutely. And I mean, one of the current projects that you mentioned that you sort of work on currently is psychological safety. And you know, so I mean, we know about it, we've heard about it, it's out there in the world, but you know, still to this day, you find many corporates who struggle with the simplicities of what are a 3-step process, or what is a 5-step process of really just gauging people at that level and creating psychological safety. And I've always found that, you know, leaders become quite disconnected and disassociated from their environment, especially in larger corporates, then simply based on the fact that they don't have a strategy. They don't know how to practically put themselves in a position where they are building a bit of psychological safety for that environment. So, I mean, from the perspective, it's something you work with. Why psychological safety still so important? And what are 3 practical kind of ways that you kind of go about doing this?
Yeah. And I think what it is I think you're right. It's actually quite simple, but it seems complex. So people shy away from it. They hear the word psychological and they're like, oh, I'm not qualified. Like, you know, that's not my area. You know, I know marketing, or I know this, or, you know, my leadership journey came from sales or whatever. So, you know, that's not me. But we have to just remember that it comes back to, you know, the 4 levels are inclusion. I feel like I belong here. That's as simple as it is. Do I feel like I belong here? Do my staff feel like I belong here? And my question I asked to the leaders is, how do you know? Like, how do you know people? Like, because some leaders have a very false sense of, I call it the false positive. They're like, oh, you know, we're totally nailing that. And that just recently happened. I was talking to someone just last week, and I'd gone out to the organization and I was speaking to their staff member who ended up in tears on the phone because they realized there's a massive disconnect between what people said they were doing and what they're actually doing. And so inclusion, I belong here. I wake up every morning and I want to come to work because I feel included. I feel accepted. For me, to use Brene Brown's language, I belong rather than feeling like I need to fit in. So that sense of belonging. 2 is I'm a learner, and I do a lot of, you know, educator by background. So I think sometimes we go into organizations, and even in schools, we do a really good job of saying to the kids, just have a try of that. But we're not so forgiving to the adults in that space around the fact that we're still learning different things. Contribution. I value everybody's contribution. And again, people go, oh yeah, no, I totally do. And you're like, well, how do you know that people feel like that you accept their contribution? And I think the other one, the one that we all know is done quite poorly, is we think that how to challenge well. And I use that Gottman's language around how to fight well, right? So it's not about not fighting, it's around how do we do it well. And the best organizations I've ever worked in as a part of it is I could go up and say, I don't agree with this, and not fear that I'm going to lose my job, or not fear that I'm going to be on the outer, or not fear that I'm going to do that kind of stuff. And so in its simplest terms, you know, belonging versus fitting in. It's okay for me to be a learner. You know, so that unconditional positive regard that I'm going to stuff up and it's okay. Contribution, that I feel valued and that I can disagree with you and we still are okay at the end of it. So in terms of 3 tips, I think it's just, I think we overcomplicate it, we overthink it. So we just got to go back to those basics. And one of the things I really talk about is just asking better questions and having a really good self-reflective practice, because I think that false positive is what creates problems, or the too hard basket.
So I just for clarity's sake, and for some people, you know, because I know you spoke through it now, but false positive, just to clarify, as I understand it, it's, you know, because another thing I've also found with a lot of leaders is they learn these wonderful constructs. They learn a word. They learn about psychological safety, and you go, okay, cool. So what are the 3 practical steps that you do to create psychological safety? And they suddenly, you know, they go into this very vague, ambiguous kind of approach to what are the practical things to do? You know, so am I right in understanding is that's part of the false positive? You know about it, but it's you're not actually doing it, or you're ticking the box.
Yeah, so tokenism versus authentic, and I call it theory into practice. Like there's a massive disconnect between knowing the theory of psychological safety and implementing it authentically versus a ticker box process. And I think, again, it comes down to, that I remember I had a leader once, he said, he started talking about this say-do gap. There's a big thing between what I say and what I do. And then he was the most horrific person at it. Like he had the worst say-do gap of anyone I'd ever worked with. So he'd say all this stuff and never follow through on anything. So, I think that we've got to move away from tokenistic, this is the flavor of the month thing. And also we've got to move it away from a HR conversation. Like it's not a performance conversation, it's a leadership conversation. These conversations need to happen. Leaders need to be part of these conversations, not, oh, that's my HR department, or that's not my this. It's an everybody conversation. And if you're not comfortable with it, the only way to get comfortable is to do it and actually practice it. I'm learning this process, so can you bear with me was I practice this, idea? So a bit of vulnerability from leaders, I think, is a really great practical tip, that they have to be a little bit vulnerable if they're not comfortable with this space. Not everyone's comfortable with all of those conversations. Sometimes it's a more learned process than others. They have to work a little bit harder at it. But a little bit of vulnerability goes a long way.
So one of the things that as you speaking through this, the say-do gap is really, I love that as a thought process, because so many people, it's completely incongruent. You kind of go, I say I'm going to do this, but then it's like, here's the results of what you're doing. And usually, is that a week that you're gonna take, or is it like 6 months you're gonna take?
Or is it a gigantic canyon between here and here, like the Grand Canyon in America?
Yeah, absolutely. And you speak about vulnerability, and we know that Brené Brown is like one of the forefathers of having this conversation. But from your perspective and your experience, why are leaders avoiding the vulnerability approach?
So I can even speak to my own leadership experiences. Is I didn't want people to think I was weak. So, and it was so funny because, there's this idea, we had this thing, and I don't know, I'm assuming it was pretty generic universally, but, leave your emotions at the door. And so that was indoctrinated into us. Leave your personal life at the door, leave your emotions at the door, leave all this kind of stuff at the door, of which I was pretty terrible at, to be honest. But anyway, but I also didn't want my leaders to think less of me if I went and asked for help. I also didn't want the teams that I was leading to think less of me, that I didn't know the answer. So it took me a long time to get my head around the fact that I don't know the answer to this, but I'll find out. Or I'm not really sure, what do you think? Because I'm really keen to know your thoughts on this. So we can demonstrate and have learned over the last, I don't know, again, many leaders fall into positions because of the skill they have, not because they've got leadership skills in terms of trained leadership skills. It kind of is us about, I think, well, here in Australia, you kind of get the leadership position and then you might get some leadership training. It's not done the other way around. So I think for the first couple of years, I reflect now on my leadership journey, occasionally with some cringy moments, around the fact that I didn't know this stuff. The only way I learned it was a lot of self-leadership, myself going out and exploring and wanting to show up differently. So once I learned that and did the research, and it was actually okay, and amazingly got just such different outcomes when I did learn to be vulnerable. But I think certainly we've got the masculine feminine story, like men have this idea about this. So I don't discredit that. Like a lot of men that I work with, and I do work with a lot of men, they're like, I've never told anybody this my whole entire life. Because I didn't want anyone to think me as weak. We grew up generationally that it was considered, the languaging around being weak was definitely there if you showed your emotions, particularly in that men's space. And women were sort of too sensitive or too much if they had their emotions. So, both ends of the extreme spectrum. So we had to find a middle ground where it's okay to share, these things, I think. And I think that's a big learning for people. And we almost have to practice it. It's like any skill. Like, if you want to get better at anything, the only way is to practice. That's kind of one of my mantras, is like, well, if you want to get better at not blowing up at this person when they say this, what have you got to do? Practice. We've got to practice that. And so it's, we practice hard skills. You want to get better at tennis, you go play tennis more. If you want to go, be a better tradesman, you go and practice that. But we don't practice the soft skills, I say in inverted commas, around vulnerability, around emotional reg, around having hard conversations. It's not something we practice. We just expect ourselves to know it all and then be able to implement it all without any training, any development, any conversations, like by osmosis or something. I don't know. So we've got this bizarre idea that we will just acquire the skills and the knowledge to be able to do the thing without practicing it. So that's another false positive, I think, sometimes.
Absolutely, yeah. And, so as you're speaking through it, you're speaking about vulnerability, but immediately my brain goes to ego. If my ego kind of gets in the way, and then I'm fearful, and I don't want to look bad, and what will people say? What will people think? I'm supposed to be the leader. I have this title, and all of that conversation occurs just before the vulnerability, and you kind of go, what if you actually just leant into that vulnerability space and allowed other people to share their opinions? I mean, I found that, very often as the leader, you don't have to say, I don't know the answer, but you can say, okay, cool, guys. I have an idea of what's happening here, but I'd like you guys to tell me what you think. Right.
Yeah,
and encourage that conversation to be happening, the more it allows for other people to share. So it may help you curb that ego a little bit. But yeah,
100%. And I think, that leaders eat last model of, going around letting everyone else speak, also from an ego, helps with that ego perspective, but also perception of ego, because I think sometimes when we're in hierarchical structures, if the leader speaks first, then people just feel like they have to oblige to that. So there's a perceived, concept around, well, I have to do this for the leader kind of thing, rather than, again, not psychologically safe to disagree or whatever. The other point I was just going to mention on that is, I think we go wrong when I often say to people, what would be your greatest fear? What are you most worried about people thinking or saying about you? And why does that bother you so much? So even just calling it out a little bit, because that ego is, you're absolutely 100,000% right. I go into where I can almost tell you, I can walk into an organization now and I can sit down and I can tell where someone's struggling with that ego blocker around being challenged by something. And you can't have challenge of safety and have a really big ego at the same time, because then it becomes a fight. And as opposed to respectfully challenging and actually having a proper conversation around, different perspectives on things. So perspective taking is impacted by ego all of the time. I went into an organization once, and the leader of the organization told me, so I had the 6 leaders in her team prior to her, and every single one of them cried in their session, every single one of them, men included, and they all said to me she micromanaged. And I got to her, and the very first thing that came out of her mouth is that she didn't micromanage. She's very supportive of her team. And my question to her was, how do you know? How do you know that's how your staff feel? And then we had another session when we were talking about certain policies in the organization, and the staff her leadership team had kind of said, look, I don't think this one really works. I don't think this one. And she couldn't let it go because she was the one that wrote them. And when she wrote them originally, they absolutely met purpose. They met fit and purpose. But 5-6 years down the track, the organization had changed. So her ego was getting in the way of allowing the policies and procedures to change with the organization. And that's where it was getting in the way.
Yeah. And as you speak through it like that, then you start realizing that, I always use the version of intention and behavior. Intention shows up wonderfully, and the intention, there's nothing wrong with the intention. Usually, it comes from a really good place. but the way that it's actioned or the way that it starts behaving and the way that it plays out in a scenario may not be the very intention you wanted for the environment in the first place. So, it's comes back to that curiosity and kind of self-awareness conversation of, is my ego getting in the way of this, or can I, ask a different set of questions, or maybe I should be, languaging the intention differently. So it becomes it's a leadership skill that we can't get away from.
And I think added to that, I think one of the greatest, most powerful repairs can be, I talk intention and impact, so very similar languaging. And I say, one of the most powerful repair processes, I can see the impact, but I want you to understand, it wasn't my intention, but I can see that it was the impact. So I'd like to apologize because it was not my intention. Instead of going, oh, I didn't mean it like that, or you've taken it the wrong way or whatever, actually acknowledging it and saying, I'm really sorry that was the impact for you. It certainly was not my intention. Can we talk through this? And again, it seems simple when you put it like that, but it's actually really hard for people to do.
Yeah, and I love the language that you're using, because, when you say I didn't mean it like that, people generally go, yeah, but you said it.
Yeah. Say do gap, say do gap, say do gap.
Right. So it's a case of going, okay, cool. I know that that's what you heard, but the repair that I need to discuss with you. And by using the word repair means that there's some kind of mending that I'm aware of, that I'm, really wanting to share from that perspective. So it becomes a very different prefacing of information. I love that. The last conversation I sort of just want to touch with you on is a project you mentioned around executive functioning of high performance teams. So, essentially, in an ideal world, we all want high performing teams. We all want teams to thrive and to be able to have good, challenging conversations and be allowed to do that. What does that sort of executive function of a high performing team look like?
Yeah, so I always describe, our executive functioning skills are something quite well researched in neurodivergence, but not really mainstream at this particular point in time. And I think it's actually a beautiful way of understanding how our brain works. So we know, particularly in the neurodivergent area of autism, that people tend to have less flexibility in their thinking. We know that in that ADHD space, they might have more issues with impulse control, but there's a whole bigger factor that goes into that. So if you think of your brain as like an air traffic control tower, in the planes coming into land is the information coming in, and the planes taking off is the information going out. The way our brain processes information in when we're calm and when we're regulated and when we're in flow and all of those kind of magic words that we say these days, is we might find that we're much more flexible. But when we start to get stressed and dysregulated, even just tired, overwhelmed, all of those things, it can actually impact our executive functioning skills. So the example I always give is I worked in really complicated environments. So I'm talking kids with knives, kids on the roof and everything. So I had to think on my feet all of the time, right? So I would think of myself as a pretty flexible thinker. So if I was giving myself a rating out of 10, like 10's totally awesome and 1 I'm terrible at it, I'd probably, when I'm calm and even in those kind of situations, I would give myself probably an 8 or 9 out of 10. I'm pretty open-minded, pretty open to solutions. But when I'm stressed and tired and dysregulated, and I'd come home from a day at work and my kids hadn't done their jobs in the house, guess how flexible I was to that not working out? I was probably about a 2 out of 10. So I'd get the, I've told you, and I'm like, whoa. And I realized that we talk about this in this neurodivergent space, but why are we not talking about this in mainstream? So I'm talking about things like our working memory. I'm talking about prioritizing and planning, our organizational skills, our time management skills. So that self-awareness and emotional regulation is part of that. Our metacognition is our reflective practices. So how I'm reflecting about things potentially in the moment so I can adapt, but also, post all of those things. We've got, there's a number of different areas in that regard. And one of the things I think happens where teams fall over is when someone's not performing well. So say, I don't know, somebody's got something going on in their personal life, and someone will come to work and they'll be slamming things on their desk and they'll be just huffing and puffing, and everyone knows to stay out of their way, right? So their emotional regulation capacity and their self-awareness of the impact they're having on others might be more limited. But for somebody else, it might look at procrastination, not meeting deadlines, not doing all of those things. They might look on the surface completely composed, but it's actually affecting them in a different way. And so one of the activities I do is I take people through this executive functioning skills idea. So we look at the 8 areas of our executive functioning skills, and then we go through that and we talk about it, and we get them to self-reflect on, when I'm calm, in flow, I'm on fire, what does that look like? What would I give myself? And then I look at it in calm and dysregulated and stressed. So sometimes you might find that people have just got terrible time management skills. Doesn't matter if they're calm, it doesn't matter if they're stressed, they've just got terrible time management skills, right? So that means the support needs to be around the skill of time management. But if they're actually really good with time management and meeting deadlines and all that kind of stuff when they're in flow, but they're terrible at when they're stressed, that might be a cue for a conversation, that curiosity you mentioned earlier with the team going, hey, normally you're pretty all over this. Are you okay? Instead of why having to meet this timeline, why, you're failing, and that performance-based conversation that comes out. If we understand those executive functioning skills. So, I'm normally turn up to meetings on time. Oh, well, she hasn't been turning up to a meeting she hasn't turned up for a meeting on time for weeks. Instead of going straight to the whole, she doesn't care, she doesn't want to be at this job, she doesn't want to do this, going, hey, I've just noticed that, you seem to be struggling. Is everything okay? Do you need a hand with anything? And to create that psychological safety in teams. And it's not about accepting not great behavior, but it's about understanding and helping and supporting this team come back together as a collective and then look at their strengths, but also to check in with each other to provide that wraparound support rather than punitive, they don't care, they leave everything to me, they do this, they do that, they do this. I think that's one of the ways that I think teams fall over. So if we can have open and honest conversations, because we need to look at that across the board.
I love that you're breaking it down into 8 different areas around, what that executive function looks like, because we know as humans, we love structure and strategy. So you have some kind of structure to kind of go, okay, cool. We know that it's not a case of just being lazy or disrespect that you haven't been on time for the last 3 meetings. But maybe there's something else. Maybe there's something affecting your executive functioning skills, and that might be your own emotional regulation, that you're having a tough time coping with something at the moment, or potentially your own time management skills and what you're giving attention to and not giving attention to. What are the that's changed in your own world or in your team's world? So suddenly, when you're breaking it down into areas to measure, perhaps, and I say measure, but use it loosely to kind of gauge, is it just this person being difficult, or is there something else going on? And I think that's a very useful mechanism for leadership execs and teams to really tap into. What else could it possibly be? Because at an executive level, very often I find that they're very proud and they're very good at what they do. That's why they hired at what they are doing. So if something's not working out, or it's not flowing as easily, perhaps there's something more to that conversation that we're not checking on.
Yeah. And I think the other part to that, so that's the first part of it. The second part is I do what's called a behavior escalation scale. So we talk about calm, anxious, dysregulated, and then this idea of recovery. And most people associated dysregulated with like this loss of emotional control, right? They've lost it. They've thrown down, down tools, and they've walked out of the meeting, or they've huffed and puffed, or they're really, but actually, your executive functioning skills, if you mapped it and had a really good self-reflective practice, there's actually signs along the way that you're moving up into dysregulation, that you can actually get to it earlier before you lose your fashizzle as it were, so that you can actually turn around and regulate yourself earlier so you don't get there. Because most people feel a lot of shame. If they get into that dysregulated state where they've missed that deadline or they've blown up at work or whatever, when you talk to them about that, they see that as a sense of failure, and there's a lot of shame associated with that. People don't like feeling like that. So, but there's actually, you know, signs along the way that maybe we're not picking up on, because if you keep getting into that state, we're missing something down here. There's something down here we've got to address earlier. So using that tool. So for me, I know personally, prioritizing and planning is probably one of the first things that goes out the window for me when I'm starting to get a little bit anxious. I'll have 10 things to do. They're all within my scope of ability to do. And I'll just be sitting there going, I don't know where to start. That's actually usually the first sign for me that I'm starting to feel a little bit overwhelmed or I'm a little bit anxious. Because of the nature of my work, I guess, and my life and growing up as a female leader where emotional loss of control was considered very inappropriate, I think probably emotional, if I've actually lost it, we're in all sorts of trouble over here, because I've had to keep myself very regulated, because it also, in the environments I was working at, being dysregulated didn't work. So, you know, that's actually usually the last thing for me. It's not the first thing. But I will notice my prioritizing and planning, my time management, my flexible thinking. I'll start to get a little bit more, I want it this way. I really don't want to change my plans. I'll start to notice those kind of things happen for me before I get to that dysregulate, like that loss of emotional control. Some people are quite happy to blow up. That's actually one of their first signs. And because they quick to anger and quick to get over it. And I'm, you know, have you ever been in those meetings and you're like, whoa, what happened there? You know, but they'll be over it like that. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to need a bit more time. That's not going to work for me. So some people, that's more comfortable for them. And I think that's part of the process too. It's not necessarily right or wrong, but we need to understand it. And you need to understand how it works for yourself, and you also need who you're okay with calling you out on it or checking in on you, and how you would like them to check in on you. I think that's the other part. You know, if I'm worried about you because you've done this or done this, now that you've identified that happens for you, you know, prioritize. You'll miss deadlines if you're feeling really stressed. If I'm worried you're not going to meet that deadline, how would you like me to check in with you and make sure that you're okay without you feeling like I'm micromanaging you or that I'm attacking you? Like, what does that look like? Because I really want to support you.
Brilliant. Yeah. Kylee, clearly we can have loads of conversation carrying on about these topics, but just as a synopsis, I'm just going to sort of do a bit of recap on what I, have taken away from today. But then, if you can leave our audience with just 3 practical things that you'd like to share, and then obviously where they can get hold of you. Sure. I like the idea that you mentioned false positives, because as much as we intend, again, it comes back to the intention. We intend to do something, and we know how to use the language. We make a procedure for it, but essentially is an actual false positive that you're sort of putting in place that's not actually yielding results, right? Another one. A big one is, stepping into that vulnerability and knowing that it's not easy, but it's an essential part of going through this process. One of the things that I love you mentioning is the power repair process, right? As much as there's power in what it is you're doing, what is the repair process if you've kind of stuck your foot in your mouth, kind of thing, and land that way, right? And then lastly, with just your executive high functioning teams, around the importance of understanding the neurodivergent areas, and knowing that there's actually 8 areas we can tap into and be more aware of as high performing teams, kind of going, let's see how we can sort of use these areas to kind of gauge where we're at and what's the team doing, and not just be as judgmental or blunt about the approach when something doesn't go the way it's supposed to, right? From your perspective, what would you like to leave the audience from today and share with us?
Yeah, so, look, I think we could have conversations for days. I think you and I are very similar in our passions around this particular space. I think one is understanding that I always ask people, what's the outcome you hope to achieve from this? And is this thing going to move us towards that outcome or move us away from it? So whatever it be, the strategy, the conversation, you know, I'm going to say this to them. Okay, is that going to get you the outcome you want, or is it going to move you further away? Like, is it more likely to get it or less likely to get the outcome you want? So just having that pause and sitting there and going, okay, is this going to move me towards that outcome that I'm seeking to achieve? I think the second one is understanding how your brain works under stress. I don't know anyone that tells me that they're not stressed. I think they're making that up if they say that they're not. We all go through periods of it. And I think if COVID has showed us anything, is that we're not really prepared from a mental health perspective around how to navigate stress. It was kind of, again, seen as one of those really abstract terms for people that just don't get on with it. And I think we've got to change that narrative around that. So understanding how your brain works in those executive functioning skills and taking lessons that we know from neurodivergent and applying in the fact that we actually all have that air traffic control tower in our brains and how we operate. And the third one I would just say is, if you're not getting the outcomes you want, are you asking the right questions?
Yes. And that's a simple one, right? Like, it's a presupposition in NLP where you kind of go, if you're sharing the communication you're getting and you're not getting the right kind of communication back, perhaps you're not asking the right set of questions, right? So
yeah,
be aware of, what it is, the responses you're getting, so that you can really formulate the communication effectively.
Yeah.
But thank you, Kylee Leota, all the way from Greater Brisbane in Australia. I think it's Brisbane, right?
Yes, Brisbane. Yes, Brisbane, Australia.
Fantastic. And she's a transformational leadership expert, leadership speaker, executive coach, facilitator and advisor, a neurodiversity, ADHD, high performance coach, educating and corporate advisory, with a new book on its way, upcoming, The Infinite Leadership. Kylee, if we need to get a hold of you, where do we go?
Yeah, so LinkedIn, you'll find me, Kylee Leota, and check the spelling. Thanks, Mum. Kylee Leota. I also run Elements for Success, so elements4success.com.au. You'll find a page on Facebook, you'll find a page on Insta, and you'll find us on LinkedIn as well.
Fantastic, guys. So with all that information, it will be in the description boxes below. Please remember to like and share, and tune into Lunchtime Series every Wednesday and Thursday for more from myself and Kylee. Have a fantastic week. Thanks for joining us, Kylee. Chat to you soon.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Cheers for now. Bye.